Well, welcome to the first installment of APPAM's new podcast, The Wonk. My name is Spence Purnell, and I am here with Dr. Samuel Staley of the DeVoe Moore Center. Dr. Staley, thank you for being with us today.
Oh, thank you for giving me this opportunity. It's great to talk to you.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, we're very excited to have this new podcast and have all these topics going and to be chatting with you today, Dr. Staley. So everyone can get to know you before we kind of get into this, could you talk a little bit about your professional background, academic background, maybe some boards or big committee meetings you've served on, some stuff like that. Just give the people an idea of where you're coming from.
I've been working in the field of public policy analysis for about 30 years. I came to Florida State about 5 years ago, back full-time into the academic world, but most of my experience has been with public policy think tanks. And a lot of that have been with more market-oriented think tanks, but I've also served as a consultant where your orientation is not relevant. It's what you actually produce for your client, which is relevant.
Exactly.
I have a PhD in public administration from Ohio State, a master's in applied economics from Wright State University, which is in Dayton, Ohio, which is where I was living at the time, and a bachelor's degree in economics and public policy from Colby College in Waterville, Maine.
Cool. Well, we know you've been around the block, and I'm actually, in full disclosure, I'm a student of Dr. Staley's here at Florida State, so we've been able to learn from him, and it's been very awesome. So let's jump right into this. The topic for the podcast is why is my rent so high? Something we really think young people are interested in. Why do our apartments cost so much? Why do we have to submit so much of our income to our rent? So to get the discussion started, I thought maybe we could bring people into some of the terminology, some of the community. So as you search around the rent policy, you'll eventually run into NIMBYs. Can you tell us what NIMBYs are and why they are important to the rental housing market?
Sure. NIMBYs are not in my backyard. And essentially they're people that object to various development projects, and it's because they literally don't want them in their backyard. One of the things that I found, and this became very clear to me when I was actually serving on my local planning board, and I was chair of my local planning board and also served on my board of zoning appeals. This was when I was living in Ohio, is that most people move into a neighborhood for the way the neighborhood looks at the time they bought their house.
Right.
And they don't think about what the change is going to be. And all cities and all neighborhoods evolve. So what happens as markets change, as the demand for different types of land changes, and hopefully if you're a growing community, it's also becoming more diverse. It has different kinds of needs. People will propose developments that don't look like what the neighborhood looked like when they moved in. And so very often what happens is this is what animates people in a very open, democratic, and decentralized decision-making process on land use. And sometimes this manifests itself in a not in my backyard, the NIMBYs, who basically are just opposed to any change. And it's hard because as a policymaker and as a policy analyst, because sometimes these people are objecting to real problems. So if, for example, you're going to, one of my favorite examples is actually in Houston. I'm a big fan of the Houston system because it's a very fluid and organic system, but it also raises issues of conflict that I think have to be addressed in the public sphere. And one of those is that if you're in a residential neighborhood with single-family houses and then somebody wants to put in an apartment building, what's that going to do to infrastructure? What kind of spillover effects or externalities are going to be addressed? And really that's what the collective decision-making space is for, is to resolve those externalities. So the question is, are people just objecting because they just don't like change, or is there an externality? From a policy perspective, that's what we have to sort out. But the bottom line is NIMBYs can delay and very often kill projects. And if you have the demand for housing and people are not able to put housing in, then you're going to constrain supply, and that's going to drive up prices. And depending on where you are, that could be pretty significant. Yeah.
So I was doing a little research before the podcast, and I've heard about some YIMBYs in San Francisco. Have you heard of these YIMBYs? Yeses in my backyard?
Yeah, I haven't seen them. I think it's a rumor out there that people talk about them. I'm not sure, but I haven't really had a sighting.
Okay.
And I've been to hunting for a long time.
Unicorns of the urban planning world.
Yeah. I think you are going to find some isolated cases that are going to be more progressive and be more open to that.
Sure.
And actually, it's possible that some places in San Francisco you might see that. But the reality is, San Francisco is known for NIMBYism.
Yeah.
That's one reason why rents are so high. In fact, they even object to the wrong people moving in. So a lot of the tech people from San Jose and Silicon Valley were moving in because they liked the lifestyle of San Francisco,
Right.
and then people were objecting to them moving in because it was driving up prices.
Interesting.
So you have to really go beyond the surface with all of this to really begin to understand what the dynamics are that are driving these the interest and the vocalization, either in support or opposition to growth.
I'm going to bring in a little quote here. We typically measure affordability as a share of households that are cost burdened, close quote, says Jonathan Spader, a senior research associate at Harvard's Joint Center for Housing Studies, open quote. In 2014, 49.3% of households were spending at least 30% of their income on rent, near the all-time high. In addition, 26% of households spend at least half of their income on rent. What we've seen over the course of the last 15 years is a consistent upward climb, close quote. So basically what he's saying is more people are spending more on their rent than ever before, and that's looking at the country as a whole, and we can talk about San Francisco and some of these specific cases. So, as a market guy and as looking at this, the first question I wanted to ask following that quote was, is this the right statistic to be looking at? Should we be looking at the ratio of incomes to rent, or is there something else that we should be looking at in terms of the effectiveness of economic and housing policy coming together, meaning how much people are getting paid versus how much they're paying for rent? Is that sort of the right ratio to look at, or in your opinion, is there something other than that that we should be looking at that would give us a good objective measure of the state of rental and housing, stuff like that?
Yeah, it's a good question. And 30% figure has been around for a long time. I look at these summary measures as indicators only. They tell you very little about the dynamics of a housing market in and of itself. So part of the problem is, I think if I look at those numbers and I'm looking at large percentages that are paying more than half of their income, that certainly would raise a red flag for me. And as an analyst and as a policymaker, I'd want to look into it. But it can't be the end of it.
Sure.
Because there are lots of reasons why people may legitimately put half of their income to rent. So, for example, I'm going to use myself as a case. When I moved down to Florida, if someone looked at how much my disposable income was being spent toward rent, it'd be close to half.
Right.
Well, let's look a little deeper into my particular situation. Well, my family was staying in Ohio because that's where my kids were in school, and we had decided not to move them. So in terms of my one-person household, that was a lot of money, a big proportion. But I certainly wasn't poor by any stretch of the imagination.
Right.
It was a little lean. In other words, I wasn't spending a lot of time.
Right.
But it was in terms of looking at the income that was available to me at the time. The other thing you'll find is that students very often spend a large portion because they don't have a lot of income. But they're making investments in their knowledge in the hopes that they are going to get a position or a job that will allow them a higher income in the future. So you have to look at these temporal conditions as well. So I think and of course the other part of it is everybody wants to pay the least amount possible for whatever they are and still live in a mansion.
Right.
So most of us would love to live in a 3-bedroom apartment by ourselves.
Right.
And only pay, we like it for free.
Right.
Right. So the question, but then
who wouldn't?
Yeah, and who wouldn't? And so part of it is going into those numbers and sort of looking at them to really, only when you do that can you determine if there's a problem or not. And then there are people that just have different preferences. I'm living in a house in Tallahassee. We have this place called Midtown. It's not real poor. It's not real expensive. I like it because it's close and I can bike onto campus. I'm living in a 3-bedroom house that 3 women lived in before because they were renting their own rooms out. I'm paying the full rent. They cut it in third. If you looked at a proportion of income, I think I'm paying a higher proportion of my disposable income to housing.
Absolutely.
Because they were able to triple up and be able to split the same rent. And while they had lower incomes than I did, as a proportion, it was probably lower.
Absolutely.
So it's all pretty complex.
Right.
At the end of the day, what we want is a dynamic housing market that comes as close as possible as meeting, allowing supply to meet demand for the specific types of housing that are being offered and been demanded in the market.
Yeah, that's a great point. And for this podcast episode, we are going to stay far away from the wage debate and incomes and all that stuff. So we'll get to that in another episode, listeners. Income inequality and all that good stuff. But another follow-up question to that is he kind of implies in the statement, in the statistic, that rent is going up. People are spending more, implying that the costs of housing are generally going up. And we've kind of already talked a little bit about NIMBYs and how local policy can raise housing costs. Can you talk a little bit about, in your opinion, what has the federal government and state governments done to either reduce or increase the prices in housing and rents?
Yeah, that's a good question. And it's interesting on this particular issue, there's a surprising amount of agreement among the left and the right in terms
Wow.
of what needs to happen. But the truth is, well, for a long time, the federal government subsidized home ownership over rental housing. And that is less true now, although it's still a factor. And the result was we had the housing market skew to being largely a homeowner, dominated by the home ownership, and then federal policies subsidizing that. Now, the interesting thing about that is that under Democrats and Republicans, that was pretty much a consistent policy. They thought home ownership was great. Well, what we found in the 2000s is that really, and one of the things that led up to the housing bubble, is that it's not true that 100% of the housing market should be home ownership. There are lots of reasons why people shouldn't own their own home.
Absolutely.
Some of it has to do with turnover. Some of it has to do with sort of lifestyle choices. Another part of it is that home ownership incurs certain financial burdens. And so, for example, if you're in a very uncertain employment situation, you probably don't want to own a home because that commits you to a long-term maintenance and tax schedule that you may not be able to fulfill. So we found that in the mid-2000s, a lot of people were getting into houses as homeowners when they probably shouldn't. They probably needed a couple more years to stabilize their income. Or then we had financial instruments that were being offered that allowed them to get in so cheaply they didn't understand the full costs. And the result was defaults, and then we've got a lot of we can go into the financial aspects between the housing bust and the burst of the housing bubble. But now I think we have a more rational view of this. We sort of recognize that there should be a balanced rental market with a home ownership market. It's not clear we need to be, 50% home ownership, but I think people are a lot more comfortable with a 65% home ownership.
Right.
So I think that's all been good. And I think part of that is I think both the left and the right have agreed that we shouldn't be subsidizing home ownership. We should have real prices, and everyone should know the full cost. So this whole notion of zero down on a house, probably not a good policy. And certainly when we're looking at things such as guaranteeing mortgages used by the federal government that are backing those guarantees, a lot of skepticism about that as well. And I think that's very healthy skepticism. But there's still, I think at the end of the day, when we look at what is driving costs in particular markets, we still end up going local. And that's also another place where there's a lot of agreement between left and right. Hate to admit it, but there are a few things that I agree with Paul Krugman on. And part of that is the way our approval processes at the local level have unnecessarily delayed construction and approval of new housing in all sorts of markets. We're not talking about
that. Kind of leads into my next question, because you were talking about the recession and home ownership, and I kind of expected that would come up throughout the course of the discussion. But the question I wanted to ask was, nobody wanted to predict the recession. Now everybody wants to write about why the recession happened, and it just seems so obvious to us all. Oh, we subsidized home ownership, we backed these loans. Obviously that was going to have a negative effect on that market. That's what everybody wants to say now. As a guy who's on the inside on this policy, you've got the audience, you've got the podcast viewers listening. What's a policy right now at local, state, federal, anywhere that you could say might have an impact like that on housing? Like if you could change one policy right now at any of those levels of government, you could say, look, this is probably the number one thing increasing housing and rental costs. Obviously it's probably not going to cause the recession again, but if you could point to one thing and kind of say, hey, this is something I think we should look at right now. This might be a problem in the future. Is there anything like that right now in the planning and housing rental community?
I don't think there's real consensus in the community, at least not that what I've seen. My number one issue continues to be, and it's been this way for 25 years, is looking at local approvals. So a lot of my academic work has actually looked at the uncertainty that's created in the approval process and what that does to housing markets and building markets. And I believe that local markets should be nimble. I think they should be adaptable. And so as things change, as the market changes, I think we should be looking at ways to try and facilitate that change, not get in the way of the change. And our current approval process tends to err on the side of stagnation and maintaining the status quo. And it has very few incentives or very...
NIMBYs, if you will, in a
NIMBYs,
sense.
but Yeah, more than that, it's just such a high deference to people that have very that just are unwilling to take on risk. So any investment requires risk, and so what will happen is you'll find people saying, "Well, I don't know if this development's going to have this positive benefit." Well, and so the default for the system is always to go to maintain the status quo, and so there are not strong incentives to allow experimentation
Right.
in innovation in the housing market. I have a couple of articles that have explored this in various journals. So I'm still believe that at the end of the day, when we're talking long term, we need to fundamentally rethink the way we decide how housing developments will be approved on the local level and build more administrative procedures into that process so that we can greenlight if there are no identifiable externalities or public welfare negative impacts, we should be able to greenlight those through an administrative process. And so what I'm finding, and this is, doing a lot of this in Tallahassee now, but it's all over the country. I've looked at Massachusetts, Ohio, Indiana, the Midwest, wherever.
Right.
We find a lot of things are stopped because of the fear an externality might be created as opposed to an evaluation of whether or not it really is likely to happen.
Right.
And so we need to grapple with that. And that is a really difficult problem to grapple with, in part because in the urban planning community, it seems to go against this fundamental value that everybody should participate in every decision that the community makes.
Right.
And part of it is because it's simply a hard problem. How do you set up the administrative processes without giving too much discretion to too many different people?
Right. Interesting. I was doing research acting as if I was a young person looking, and if you look online or Google and try to find cheap rent or whatever, you inevitably run into these top 25 cities to live in, top 30 cities for young people, trending 20, whatever you want to call it. You find them all over the web, and places like Forbes and stuff like that, and they have these algorithms that rank the cities on this. And one of the factors, inevitably, everyone I found, median rent. Median rent is included in the algorithm, telling you whether this is a good city to live in as a young person. And yet, my personal observation and the observation of some of my peers in the community is that in any city you go to, almost inevitably, there's what we could very generally call maybe a good part of town and a bad part of town, like you were sort of saying about Midtown. There's so I've talked to a lot of people, young people who move, and they look at median rent or general, San Francisco is expensive, this place is cheap, and then you get there and maybe the part of the city that you want to live in is twice as expensive as you thought it was, and then where you don't want to live is twice as cheap as you thought it was. So really, median rent, or this idea that there's a medium housing cost, what can you say about policy that creates those those pockets? Why isn't there a median rent in Tallahassee? Why don't all the apartments cost about the same? Why are they half as cheap on one side of the city as twice as expensive on the other side? And is there a government policy at play in that?
Yeah, there is and there isn't. A median is simply a statistical summary measure. That's all it is, and so we can't impute any meaning into that measure other than that's what it is. Median. You take all the rents, you rank them, and at the 50th level percentile, that's where the median rent is. So I think what the median rent tells you in these rankings is what the relative cost of living is. That's all it tells you for the metropolitan area. Honestly, if someone's using those rankings to decide where they're going to move, well, let's just say they're not going to be high on my hiring list because those measures are simply don't have any content. And I'm saying that because I actually have several good friends who actually make a lot of those indexes or indices. But so the problem is what we have is that housing is by its nature a long-term investment. And the value of that housing will change based on the demand for the location. So location is really important, as well as how long that physical capital, that infrastructure will last. Mm-hmm. A well-maintained house could last hundreds of years. A poorly maintained house could last 5 years. You can see some pretty dramatic deterioration. If you don't keep the plumbing up and you have problems come in and that type of thing, or it's not being rented out so people are not using it, it'll deteriorate much faster. So even in a neighborhood that is growing, you might find that there are going to be houses that are actually very expensive or not, or or a lot cheaper depending on maintenance and depreciation and that type of thing. But at the end of the day, what we find is that people, their own interests in housing change, and the neighborhoods will reflect that. And sometimes it can be the case where a certain group, if the drug dealer moves in next door to you, that reduces the value, your personal value of your current location. So that can also have an effect. And then there are trends. I mean, there are hot places. If you go to Washington, D.C., I remember when I was there, DuPont Circle was the place to be. And for many people it is again, but it went through a period where it wasn't.
Right.
Adams Morgan was known for its eclecticism and sort of really cool restaurants and that type of thing. I actually lived on Capitol Hill in Northeast, and it was on the edge. And my own neighborhood, over the course of 20 years, went from really bad to pretty good to really bad to pretty good. So all of that has to do with the dynamics of the neighborhood and who's moving in and who's not. And neighborhoods will get reputations as well. The area around the convention center in Washington, D.C. is now a really hip place. When I was in Washington, D.C., that you would not be caught after dark in those areas. 7th Street, 8th Street, Howard University, Convention Center, New York, where the New York Avenue Metro stop is right now. So you basically, every city has that. And even Tallahassee, which is a small city, you will go from block to block, and you will find that there are blocks that are really doing well, and then you'll find that blocks are really doing poorly.
Sure.
So even our poor neighborhoods have those pockets that are actually doing reasonably well.
Right.
And it depends on schools and lots of other things too, other kinds of public goods that people are trying to maximize.
Well, Dr. Staley, thank you for your insight on the topic. And the last question we always ask all of our podcast interviewers is, what are some advice for aspiring PhD students, master's students like myself, people who are getting into it, not even necessarily in housing policy, but for aspiring young policy scholars in today's world?
Yeah.
If you could leave a piece of advice with us, what would it be?
Well, actually, the advice is very different for PhDs versus MPAs.
Well, let's hear it.
Because the master's, what the great thing about an MPA program does, or any sort of applied master's program, is it gives you tools. And so you're really thinking about going into the workforce. And so keep in mind that what you're really trying to do is find that opportunity that allows you to begin to develop your skills. Most of your skills will not be developed until you're actually in the job. So don't worry if you don't get the director of economic development for the city right out of your MPA program. Think about the jobs that are going to allow you to explore different aspects of your interests and how your skills will match with that, and be patient. Because you'll also, one of the things I look for when I'm hiring someone at maybe an MPA level, I'm looking for their willingness to commit to the job and do the job that I'm asking them to do and stick around for more than 6 months. So I almost always recommend someone going into the workforce that whatever job they take, even if they end up in the job and find it's terrible, stay for at least a year. Because, and I tell people this, and I'm not sure if we said it in our classes, but in the United States, the beautiful thing about our culture is you don't fail until you're 30. You can do over and over and over again. You can try and start new things. And until you're 30, everyone's going to give you a pass because they know you're working it out. But by the time you're 30, you need a track record. If you're still jumping from job to job at 30, the employer's going to look at you and say, yeah, maybe you're not quite there yet. You're a little bit, I need someone who's more seasoned, more focused, and more committed. And so I think that's important to think about. And so that's part of it. And then also always keep yourself open to new opportunities as they emerge within the position you're in now, as well as maybe externally. PhD students, get those pubs. Get in academic journals, because most of the time you're probably going to be in a research position, if not at a university, then in a major agency, and that is your currency. That shows your talent, your ability, your willingness to stick to it and do serious research, and that's what the PhD is for.
Cool. Well, Wonk listeners, we thank you for tuning in. Once again, this is Dr. Samuel Staley of the DeVoe Moore Center at Florida State. Dr. Staley, thanks again for chatting with us, and glad to have you.
All right, thanks. Thanks, Spence.